A few weeks ago when we had Matthew 16, I pointed out that scripture scholars commonly agree that the longer section about, the keys of the kingdom and the gates of hell, etc., probably came from the early community rather than from the lips of Jesus on that particular occasion in his earthly life. Well, the same goes for this today. The first part, at least, of this gospel. A couple of indications. First of all, the same one that we had 2 chapters ago, where it says, tell it to the church. Well, there was no church in Jesus' time. So this is a reflection of the early community trying to make, greater sense and apply the teachings of the Lord, in those first decades. Even more telling, though, I think, is what comes after that, where it says, if he refuses to listen even to the church, treat him as you would a Gentile or a tax collector. Well, that clearly is not from Jesus' mouth. In his ministry, Jesus had nothing but good things to say about Gentiles and tax collectors. He made them the heroes of his stories. And he ate with them, despite the complaints of the religious people. So it's very telling that as the early community began to form a group, they did what every group does. They get rigid and they start making rules, exclusionary rules, and judging. Now, part of that is necessary, of course, but any group, and especially any church, has to be careful of what kind of spirit guides them. Groups have membership rules, but then it becomes only you can join, and you certainly can't join, and these are the rules. Jesus went around breaking all the rules during his earthly life, so how do you reconcile that? That's pretty hard, I understand, but we got to be aware of the tension and the dynamic, and we haven't even been aware of the tension and the dynamic. But at least we do have things here, very likely from the lips of Jesus in his earthly life, when he speaks about, if 2 of you agree on earth about anything. By the way, the word in Greek there is symphonesis, symphony, the word we get symphony from. If 2 or 3 of you are in symphonic harmony about anything, obviously that's a powerful prayer to the Father. And indeed, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there am I. I mean, that's really magnificent. A magnificent sense of the deep mystical reality, the deep mystical depth of community, of a group gathered together. And by the way, we have the same thing here also that we had in Matthew 16. Whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Throughout history, of course, we've taken that in the singular from Matthew 16 and applied it to the Pope. But here it's in the plural. Whatever you all decide, you faithful, whatever the community decides, shall be loosed and bound in heaven as well. So again, the power and the richness and the depth of community, which we haven't appreciated enough. The other thing here in today's gospel, and it's very rich, obviously, is that first part about if your brother sins against you, etc., go and tell him yourself. I always like to preach on this because it's very practical. It goes back to what I learned in moral theology when we talked about fraternal correction. You may have heard the phrase. So in other words, under what circumstances do you go and actually tell your brother or sister that you have something against them? I mean, when do you decide to do that and not? So here are some good rules that the church over the centuries came up with in moral theology to apply this gospel. And it's very, very, very practical for us. There are 3 conditions, according to moral theology. 3 conditions for correcting your brother or sister. 1, it has to be an important matter. So don't go telling your wife, your husband, you chew too loud. All right? get used to it, adapt to the little things, You can discuss it and all in the right context, but you can't go fussing over the little stuff. Number one. Number two, you have to have some actual social responsibility for the person. In other words, the person has to somehow be under your responsibility. So you don't go correcting, the person on the grocery line ahead of you. It's not your business. If there's a serious matter you need to discuss with someone who's your employee or your family member or someone with whom you have a relationship of responsibility, then okay. And third, and maybe most important of all, you have to have some reasonable expectation of the success of your intervention. So if you know that the person is absolutely not going to listen to you, either because of his or her beliefs or his mood or his personality or his situation in life or just at this particular time, shut up. Don't do it. So I think that takes care of about 97% of fraternal interventions. To leave that out, stop. If it's not important enough and it's not under your responsibility and if there's not much hope for success. So I've preached on this before. Today what came to mind when we're talking about community and maybe correcting each other in community, I think there's a much bigger issue that we have to face now than any of those things I just mentioned. And it's that all of us are so opinionated today. In the church, in the country, and we're so sure that I'm right and you're wrong that we can easily have fraternal correction that's way out of line and way off base because we're so convinced of our own positions and we can't even talk to each other anymore. I think that currently is a much more serious issue in this matter. So, for example, and not to be too topical, I have heard serious Catholics say, you absolutely cannot be a Catholic or a Christian and vote for Donald Trump in November. Now, you may cringe when you hear that, or you may say, absolutely, I agree. But I've heard, of course, the opposite. I've heard very sincere, practicing Catholics and Christians say, you absolutely cannot be a Catholic or a Christian if you vote for Biden in November. And both of them are sincere, and both of them are convinced, not only that they're right, but that it's really serious. So what do we do? The only thing we can do and learn how to do in the church and in the country is listen to each other. Start by assuming the absolute sincerity of the other party. That really is what they believe. Prayerfully, even. And then can you sit down and actually discuss? Can you treat one another with respect as brothers and sisters? We can't be like Ezekiel, thinking that we have to say, you do that and you're going to die. And the Lord wants me to tell you that, or else I'm going to be held responsible for your death. That's what the first reading is about, if you noticed. First of all, you're not Ezekiel. And second of all, that's 2,500 years ago. We're in a different space and time right now. So the rules of dialogue are, and we all need to learn them, if not about this issue, then about 10,000 other issues in our lifetime, as Christians and human beings, and as Americans even, is you sit down and out of respect want to hear what the other person believes and why they believe it. Staying calm and without interrupting them, It'll allow them to stay calm. And you wait. So you don't come into the discussion on either side determined to persuade the other person. No. You come in to listen. And on both sides with an openness, possibly, who knows, to change your mind when you hear the other person. Now, you may not persuade each other, and that's not what you're going in for, as I say. But what you will do is build a bond of trust for your brothers, with brothers and sisters. So you'll make a symphony, not by playing the same instrument in the same way, right? But by playing your own different instrument and see what happens. But for this we need to, well, first of all, do what the Psalm says. We have to be really listening for the Lord's voice. And by the way, if you have reached a point in your life where you need an actual physical, personal intervention of somebody to tell you you're at fault about something, you're really not listening. If today you hear his voice, harden not your hearts. So the Lord is constantly telling you all day long and every day how you need to change, what you need to adjust. So if you need some external person to tell you, it means you're not listening to the Lord. And he'll speak to you either directly by inspiration, if you know how to listen. Most people don't. Or by events, things that happen in your life. But anyway, one thing the Lord definitely tells us is love one another. And one of the first signs of love and proofs of love is that you respect one another, welcome and listen to one another, and embrace one another in your differences. That's the only way community can be formed. And that is, in fact, the one commandment that Jesus left us. He didn't say, you got to be right on everything, or else you're going to hell. No, he said, love one another. He didn't talk about being right, or believing this, or being convinced of that. That doesn't create relationship. That creates right people who are insufferable. What we need to do is create loving people who know how to embrace one another and talk to one another. And as I say, you may create more of a symphony in your exchange when you begin to trust one another and maybe start really listening to one another and maybe even changing your view. But it has to start with the welcome. Assuming the integrity and the goodwill of your interlocutor, as I say, and respect them as brothers and sisters. That second reading today, as we continue with Romans, is a perfect example of this. It's not just Jesus who said, one new commandment I give you, love one another as I have loved you. That is perfectly accepting you as you are, Peter, and all of you and all your faults. But Paul himself says that today, right? Owe nothing to anyone except to love one another. The one who loves has fulfilled the law, and that's the last line too. It's translated here, love is the fulfillment of the law. Bad translation. The word in Greek is pleroma. Pleroma is a Gnostic word which means the fullness of absolutely everything. The pleroma. Love is the pleroma of the law. In other words, it's not just saying it's the fulfillment of the law, it's saying it's the totality of the law. It's the perfect embodiment of everything the law has. That's what love is. Because, as he says, all the commandments, you shall not kill, steal, covet, are summed up by saying you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Because love does no evil to the neighbor, so love is the whole law. And Jesus says the same in the gospel, right? All the law and all the prophets hang on those two commandments of loving God and loving your neighbor as yourself. So, give up for a few minutes your absolute psychotic need to be right and start to be in relationship. Requires real vulnerability, requires real courage, requires real strength of character, requires love. Learn to love your neighbor. If you have to start by making it love your enemy, okay, start with that. But we have to love one another. Otherwise, the country goes down the tubes, the church goes down the tubes, we become insufferable and intolerant of each other, and we're miserable, and the world is miserable, and what do we gain by being right? Not to mention we probably aren't even right. Who knows? So stop correcting your neighbor and start correcting your own attitude. Let's do that first. Learn how to love and welcome and listen and be calm and realize that the universe is not going to explode or expand based on the results of your discussion. That it can be a process, that it can be patient. You can be patient. And then we might, in fact, not only save the church and save the country and save the world, but we might actually wind up being Christians. Or even better, in a sense, human beings. That's what we're made for. To be one planet and one human race. And there are always going to be diversities of opinion and religions and politics and everything. But it can be a symphony if we let it be. So let's tune up our instruments and get going.